Hello everyone. So I haven't done a video on the subject of 3D printing in a while, and this is a good opportunity to do so because I have acquired a new or a second 3D printer. The reason being that my earlier printer I had made a lot of mistakes with it, to be frank. This is going to be a warts and all type of presentation video, so I'm not going to show you anything glamorous or polished. This is going to be a sort of nuts and bolts mistakes I've made kind of confession. And yeah, my earlier printer was not damaged, but it was becoming irreparable, I suppose you could say, and I was getting a lot of faults and misprints and so on. So I thought the time had come. It's been a couple of years, so the time had come to learn from my mistakes, get a new printer, and start all over again. And I have to say, I've had this about a month now, and things are going really well. So my earlier printer was an Anycubic Photon Mono X. This is a very similar printer. It's an Anycubic Photon M3 Plus. So it's got a number of refinements on my earlier printer that I was more than happy with. It's just that as I say, I was new to 3D printing and allowed it to fall into a state where you know, it wasn't worth continuing with it. So what this one has, which is an improvement on my earlier printer, is that it has a slightly larger build plate. So this is the build plate for this printer, slightly larger, not so much that you can really say you can print much bigger models on it, but it is slightly bigger. It also has, I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but the surface of the printer is sort of patterned. It's got a kind of very slight kind of texture to it, I suppose you could say, and that does mean that prints are a little bit more likely to be attracted to the print plate rather than to the film at the bottom of the resin tank, and therefore you're going to get more success with your printer. Another refinement it has is, which I'm not using at the moment and probably won't, so I'll talk about that a little bit later, is that it's got a reservoir that you can pour resin into, so that the resin tank here holds 500 mils maximum. But if you are printing something that requires more resin than that, rather than pause the print and replenish this tank, you have a reservoir that will automatically feed resin into the printer as required. I'm not going to use that, probably because I can't think of any models at the moment that I want to print that are going to require more than 500 mils. And it's an additional burden of care and maintenance that I want to sort of try and avoid for the time being. And that is really one of the reasons why things began to go wrong with my earlier printer, was that I didn't maintain it, particularly in terms of cleaning it of resin and so on, as efficiently as I should have done. So I'm making more effort to do so with this particular printer. Now, This isn't intended to be a how-to or an expert guide or anything like that. It's kind of halfway house between allowing people to decide whether they want to get a printer in the first place and some of the problems they're going to encounter, and then it's also sort of tips that I have picked up from my earlier experience that I want to pass on to people who may not be aware of it, may be at the sort of similar stage to I am in their 3D printing journey. One of the things that you definitely have to have, I think, is an available source of running water and a sink. So that is obviously going to vary from one household to another and one individual to another. In my particular case, the only sinks I have in my house are in my kitchen and my bathroom, and both of those rooms are on the same side of the house, and it's the side of the house that gets a lot of direct sunlight from midday onwards into the evening. And I hadn't realised with my earlier printer how much of a problem that can be. One of the things that these printers are supposed to have are these covers which are supposed to block UV light, and they do so, but it's not 100% efficient. So my first tip would be, if you do have to position your printer, and also off camera here I've got my wash and cure machine which has got a similar type of cover, but if you do have to position your printer and so on and other devices in rooms where there is going to be direct sunlight, then be aware that this shield isn't going to entirely block sunlight. So try and keep it out of definitely try and keep it out of direct sunlight, and unfortunately I can't do that anywhere in my kitchen. So this particular way I've got this positioned, it does get sunlight for about an hour or two directly on it, around sort of, it depends on the time of year, but around sort of 2 o'clock in the afternoon it's going to get direct sunlight on it. So it looks unsightly, doesn't, as I say, this is warts and all, but what I do is I permanently have a cover. I've just got an old bit of sheeting or whatever this is over it, just to act as an additional block on direct sunlight going through that yellowish shield, and potentially curing, not only curing the resin that's in the vat, but also curing resin that might have collected on top of this printer as it dips into the reservoir and so on and lifts out again. So definitely, you know, keep it out of light as much as you possibly can. And I've also, this is probably being over cautious, but my kitchen where I have this is lit in the night and in the evenings with halogen lights, and some of them are LED sort of type things, but some of them are described as daylight bulbs. So I've got a mixture of sort of light that looks yellowish and light that looks white, and I do wonder whether the white ones in particular do have a kind of UV wavelength similarity that might potentially act on the resin. So this, I keep this, as I say, I keep this on all the time to block any light getting into the printer. but also I don't take this off and change things or empty the tank or whatever in the evening when I've got the light bulbs on, or during the day when it's sort of afternoon or something. So I try to work with the cover off at times of the day when the lighting is very poor, so you know, around dusk and around dawn. Dimsy is the way a friend of mine would describe that time of day. So in very kind of poor lighting, where I can see what I'm doing without having to have the ceiling lights on or having a lot of sunlight coming in through the window. In terms of another tip that I've discovered, or a few tips I've discovered in terms of making the prints more efficient, is to, as I say, this is quite a large plate. Now, a lot of the slicing software that you will get automatically on a memory stick with any printer you buy, a lot of it is was designed originally for the smaller print plates. And a useful tip that I found on a YouTube video was that when you get up to print sizes that, you know, which are print plates which are this big, and this isn't terribly big, but it is bigger than the smaller Elegoo, Mars and so on type size printer, is that you need to have a slightly larger lift distance in order to allow the flexible film to have reached its sort of stretch point and flip back. Otherwise it's going to lift up with the film, if you imagine my hand as the film, and then it's going to go back down and the film won't have detached from the plate. So go into your parameters in your slicing software and double whatever the lift distance was. So I can't remember exactly, but I think mine was when I set this up and looked on the computer and put the software into the computer. My slicing parameter lift distance I think was 3mm, so I've doubled it to 6, and I've also slowed down the lift speed. So I've halved that, and it's made the machine a lot quieter to operate, but obviously both of those, changing those two parameters, has added to the amount of time that the print takes to actually print. So it's a trade-off between time and getting a decent print in the first place, and I'm happy to add sort of hours to the print time if I'm gonna succeed every time. And so far I've had one very minor failure, which I think was just circumstance. It was at the very end of a print, a very fine, almost like a shaving, came off at the very end, but other than that I've had no problems so far. To go back to that matter of sunlight, as I say, the wash and cure, which I got off camera, is an identical situation. So I never leave the alcohol tank in my wash and cure other than when I'm using it. I take it out as soon as I have used it and replace it with the rotating table for the curing part of the process. So that table, and I put the wash tank away in a cardboard box out of direct sunlight. And the reason for that is that as time goes on and you know, it does its job and washes resin off of the printed model, you are going to have uncured resin floating about in your alcohol tank, and if you leave it all day out in the sun, that's going to cure, and then you're going to get cured resin on your in your tank, so particles in your tank which are going to adhere to the model. So you may not be able to see, because I've been doing my best to clean this up, but the wire basket, you know, has got, from not knowing that that problem, has got a lot of kind of dissolved resin that's sort of washed off in the alcohol, and then it's collected to the wire frame, and then over the course of the months has begun to cure and harden and stick to that. So I've been trying to chip this off gradually, but that can kind of cause you problems if it sticks to anything, you know, like your model that you're washing and then you cure it. It can cause you kind of irregularities on your model. So all that to do with the daylight is definitely you know, worth taking into account. Another thing that I've got to get out that I found does seem to help is that just before you do a print, you give a tiny squirt of WD-40 onto the bottom of the film of the resin tank, and then wipe it off immediately, and you'll have a kind of molecular sized coating of WD-40 on that, which means that it's less attractive to the model and more likely to stick to the print plate. So that's another thing that I've been discovering. But a massive mistake that I made with my first printer was that I kind of thought it was all right to leave resin in the tank until you had a misprint, and you know, you could go on printing model after model after model without any problem. That definitely isn't the case. I would highly recommend that whether or not your print fails, after every print you empty the resin tank. So you run the resin, take this off your model or your printer, run it through a funnel and a filter back into the resin bottle, get rid of all the resin in there, try and work, again the same principle applies about the lighting, try and work in conditions of low lighting so that sunlight isn't falling off this tank. Once you've poured the resin away, another thing to do is to use this spatula here to scrape the rest of the resin off and get as much as it off, and then wipe the rest off with a kitchen towel, and then pour alcohol into that resin tank to clean off any that's left on it. On the subject of this spatula, you get two spatulas with the machine. This one here, I've even seen people, you're not supposed to use a sharp object on the resin tank, and this spatula is intended to remove models from the print plate. This one is quite the opposite. This isn't a sharp object, but I've even seen YouTube channels where the host has complained about how useless this particular spatula is at getting models off the print plate. That is not what this one is intended for, although admittedly it's not made clear in the instructions, which are altered from Chinese. Again, the Chinese element to this I'm going to talk about a little in a moment, but this is intended to clean the resin tank. That's its purpose, and that's what it should be used for. Don't use it for anything rigorous, and don't use the sharpened spatula on the film and the resin tank. As soon as you notice any damage to the film at the bottom of the resin tank, then replace it, because resin will go through the damaged film onto your light emitting screen in there, and then harden and then cause additional damage to this. And that is the problem, to get back to some of the issues I had with my first one. That is why you should always empty the resin tank, regardless of whether you've had a failure or not, because some failures can be very small, barely noticeable, and you will get, you know, lumps of semi-cured resin floating around in your resin tank, which the build plate will then press on at a later period and, you know, cause damage to the resin tank, which will then, because resin will seep through it onto the light emitting plate, will cause damage to that. Another aspect, another improvement of this machine is that it comes with a protective film over the light emitting plate, so you can peel that off and replace it with another one. So it does give you an additional level of protection, which I like. Two things I'm not terribly keen on. One is the resin reservoir, because that again has the potential to you know, sort of get contaminated with cured resin particles and so on, and add to this whole issue of potential damage. And at the moment I don't need to use it, as I say. But another thing that I'm not going to do is that the previous machine I had, and this one even more so, has a kind of Wi-Fi compatibility, which allows you to do everything remotely rather than putting a memory stick in, which I think you can see I've got stuck in the side there. It allows you to talk remotely to the machine and get it to print using an app. And I am a little bit suspicious about that kind of thing anyway. I think you have to be, you know, in the modern age we have to be a little bit savvy about the potential for hostile regimes and so on, just to sort of gently infiltrate our you know, it's not a question of massive enemy infiltration of our hardware, which I'm sure they make attempts to do, but I'm reluctant to allow any sort of Wi-Fi access to my home or my devices, partly because at a time of crisis it is possible for hostile agents to switch on, you know, Wi-Fi devices across the country and cause surges of power and blackouts and so on, just to add an additional element of damage to infrastructure and so on. So I don't see any point in having a Wi-Fi connection, and there is that very slight and very, you know, sort of minor kind of insidious risk to having those kind of things in your house, so I keep them out of my own household. And I think that is everything I wanted to say on the subject of my new printer and how I'm getting on with it. As I say, it's going much better than my previous experience, where I managed to damage the film in my resin tank and had to replace it often. It got to the stage where I had hardened resin on the light emitting plate down there and couldn't get that off. And that is, you know, you can replace the plates in these, but on the device I had, you needed to know the serial number of the machine in order to do it, in order to buy the appropriate replacement part, and it was fiddly to do that anyway. But in the case of my machine, you had to virtually take it apart completely because the serial number was around the back of the inside of the machine. So it was a real palaver. So I thought it was not much more expensive and a lot easier to get a new device, which is what I've done. So I hope that's given people some useful tips and maybe help people to decide whether they want a 3D printer in the first place or not. It's not for everybody. A lot of people will find it far more efficient and even less expensive to buy printed models when they want, but I just love the whole element of 3D printing, that you can collect vast archives of models and print them up when you need them, which is what I'm doing at the moment. So thanks very much for watching. See you on the next video. Bye for now.